Julia Benton, a steadfast ER nurse, finishes a grueling shift when a man collapses in the hospital parking lot, bleeding heavily. Ignoring the danger, she rushes to shield him as a black SUV speeds toward them, gunfire erupting. A bullet tears through her shoulder, but she protects the stranger, who vanishes mysteriously. In the ICU, confusion mounts. No record of the man exists. Whispers of a cover-up swirl as a cryptic note and a Marine Corps coin appear, hinting at a larger classified mission. Julia, under watchful eyes, begins to suspect she saved someone far more significant than anyone admits. Inspired by Julia's courage? Share your own stories of bravery in the comments and let's celebrate everyday heroes. Subscribe for more gripping tales that remind us to act with heart. Share this video to spread the message. Courage lives in us all. Support our channel and keep these stories alive. The night was heavy with the kind of stillness that only a hospital parking lot at 2 a.m. could carry. Julia Benton, a 28-year-old emergency room nurse, had just clocked out after a grueling 12-hour shift at Baxter Regional Medical Center. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her sneakers scuffed, and her auburn hair, pulled back in a messy ponytail, clung to the sweat on her neck. Exhaustion weighed on her like a second skin, but her mind was still racing, replaying the codes, the charts, the patients she'd fought to stabilize. As she stepped into the cool Arkansas air, her breath caught at the sight of a man staggering across the lot, his silhouette swaying under the harsh glow of a street lamp. Blood bloomed across his white shirt, a vivid red stain spreading like spilled ink. His knees buckled, and he crumpled to the asphalt. Julia's heart lurched. Instinct kicked in, sharper than any fear. She dropped her bag, her keys clattering to the ground, and sprinted toward him. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but her training kept her steady. Assess, act, don't think twice. She was halfway to the man when the screech of tires sliced through the night. A black SUV roared into the lot, its headlights blinding. Julia's stomach twisted as the vehicle barreled toward them, showing no sign of slowing. Then came the gunfire, sharp, relentless cracks that echoed off the hospital walls. Panic surged through her, but something deeper, something unyielding, held her in place. She couldn't leave him. Not like this. In a split second, Julia made a choice that would haunt her dreams for years. She threw herself over the stranger, shielding his limp body with her own. The world slowed as she braced for impact. Pain seared through her shoulder, a white-hot explosion that stole her breath. The bullet had found her. She collapsed beside the man, her vision swimming, her arms slick with blood. As the SUV's engine faded into the distance, the lot fell silent again, save for the ragged sound of her breathing and the faint groan of the man beneath her. She didn't know his name, his story, or why death had come for him tonight. All she knew was that she'd done what she had to. Days later, Julia walked into the hospital lobby, her shoulder bandaged and her arm cradled in a sling. The pain was a constant companion now, a dull ache that flared with every step. She'd spent the last week in a haze of recovery, her mind replaying the parking lot over and over. Had she been reckless, brave, stupid? She wasn't sure. Her father's voice echoed in her head. Right is still right, even if you're the only one doing it. But it didn't quiet the doubts. She felt fragile, exposed, like the world had seen too much of her. Yet she'd insisted on returning to work, refusing to let fear keep her home. The lobby was bustling as always, patients shuffling to appointments, nurses exchanging clipped greetings. But something was different today. A hush fell over the room as Julia stepped inside, and her eyes landed on a group of 12 Marines standing in perfect formation near the reception desk. Her breath caught. Their uniforms were crisp, their faces solemn, and their presence seemed to command the air itself. One of them, a man with close-cropped hair and eyes that held a quiet intensity, stepped forward. His voice was steady but thick with emotion. "Ma'am, you saved my life that night," he said. "And you saved more than just me, Timon." The words hung in the air, and the hospital seemed to hold its breath. Julia's heart pounded, her mind struggling to process what was happening. The man she'd shielded, the stranger bleeding out in the parking lot, was standing before her, alive. And whatever came next, it was enough to silence the entire room. Julia Benton had always carried a kind of silence with her, not the hollow kind that comes from absence, but the weighty kind that speaks louder than words. She was born and raised on a quiet patch of land just outside Mountain Home, Arkansas, where the world felt vast and untouched. The roads were unpaved, kicking up clouds of red dust whenever a pickup truck rattled by. Her family's farmhouse was modest, its white paint peeling under the relentless sun, surrounded by towering pines that swayed and whispered in the wind. Those trees had been her childhood companions, their rustling a lullaby on sleepless nights. The nearest neighbors were a mile away, and the coyotes' distant howls were more familiar than the sound of traffic. It was a place where time moved slowly, where life was shaped by the rhythms of the land and the lessons of those who worked it. Her father, Roy Benton, was the backbone of their small world. A Gulf War veteran, he'd once been a man of quiet strength, with broad shoulders and a laugh that could fill a room. But war had left its mark. A roadside bomb in '91 had shattered his leg and scarred his body with nerve damage that never fully healed. By the time Julia was old enough to notice, his limp was as much a part of him as his calloused hands. He never spoke of the pain, though she saw it in the way he winced when he thought no one was watching. Every morning without fail, he rose at 5 a.m., his boots scuffing across the porch as he made his way to the workshop behind the house. Some days he built furniture, simple, sturdy pieces that sold at the local market. Other days, when the pain was too much, he sorted screws into old coffee cans, his hands moving with deliberate calm. Work was his religion, structure his salvation. He taught Julia that values weren't just words. They were the choices you made when no one was looking. Her mother, Ellen, had been the heart of the family, a woman whose warmth could thaw even the coldest Arkansas winter. She'd had a knack for making ordinary moments feel special, baking cinnamon rolls on Sunday mornings, stringing fairy lights for Christmas, singing off-key while she hung laundry on the line. Julia could still picture her mother's smile, the way her hazel eyes crinkled at the corners. But when Julia was 10, Ellen fell ill, a sudden merciless sickness that stole her in less than a month. The loss gutted Roy, leaving him a quieter, more shadowed version of himself. For Julia, it was a wound she didn't yet know how to name. The farmhouse grew still after that, the laughter replaced by the creak of floorboards and the hum of an old radio. Roy did his best, but he was a man built for duty, not tenderness. He raised Julia with love, but it was a love expressed through lessons, through the expectation that she'd grow into someone strong enough to face a world that didn't always play fair. Roy's words became Julia's anchor. Right is still right, even if you're the only one doing it. Bound, she carried them so like a talisman through her teenage years, when peer pressure and small-town gossip could have pulled her off course. She wasn't perfect. She had her moments of déroute, of wishing she could blend in with the kids who snuck beers by the river or skipped class for a thrill. But she held fast, volunteering at the local food bank, tutoring younger students, staying late to help teachers stack chairs. It wasn't about being a saint. It was about proving to herself that she could live up to her father's expectations, even when it left her feeling like an outsider. Popularity was fleeting, she told herself, but integrity was forever. When it came time for college, Julia didn't dream of ivy-covered campuses or big city lights. She chose the University of Central Arkansas in Conway, drawn by its solid nursing program and the fact that it was only a 2-hour drive from home. She wanted to stay close to Roy, whose health was starting to falter. Subtle signs, like the way he leaned on the kitchen counter a little longer each morning. College was a grind, a blur of late nights and early mornings. To pay her way, Julia worked shifts at a diner off Highway 65, pouring coffee for truckers and wiping down tables sticky with syrup. The tips were meager, but they kept her car running and her tuition bills paid. Some nights, after a double shift and hours of clinical protocols, she'd collapse onto her dorm bed, her body screaming for rest, but her mind too wired to sleep. She'd stare at the window, watching the headlights of passing cars, wondering if she'd make it through another semester. Money was always tight. Julia learned to skip meals when she could bear it, saving her dollars for cock and textbooks. She didn't tell her classmates about the nights she went to bed with an empty stomach or the weeks when she drove on bald tires because she couldn't afford new ones. Complaining felt like giving up, and Julia Benton didn't give up. Her professors saw her determination. The way she'd stay late in the lab, her hands steady even after hours of note-taking. Patients in her clinical rotations noticed her quiet care, the way she'd adjust a pillow or listen to their fears without rushing off. She wasn't the type to draw attention, but she was the one people remembered, the one they trusted when the world felt unsteady. In the hospital lobby, as the Marine's words echoed in her, Julia felt that trust again. Not just from him, but from the 11 men standing behind him, from the nurses who'd whispered her name in the halls, from the patients who'd seen her at her best. Her shoulder throbbed, her heart raced, but she stood still, just as Roy had taught her. Whatever came next, she was ready to carry its weight. On those quiet Sunday evenings when the world seemed to slow down, Julia Benton would return home from her demanding life as a nurse to share a simple supper with her father, Roy. They'd settle on the creaky wooden porch of their modest home, the sky ablaze with the hues of a setting sun, its golden rays filtering through the sprawling oak trees that lined their property. Sometimes they sat in companionable silence, the kind that felt full rather than empty, each lost in their own thoughts, yet tethered by love. Other times their conversations wove through the weighty matters of life, war, the endless churn of news, the fragility of existence, and what it meant to be a person who left the world a little better than they found it. Roy, a man of few words but profound wisdom, once looked at his daughter with a quiet intensity and said, "You don't need a fancy title to change things, Julia. You just need to show up when it matters most." Those words, spoken under a fading sky, settled into her heart like seeds in fertile soil. She didn't know then how they'd bloom, how they'd guide her through a moment that would test the very core of who she was. It was a Tuesday night, unremarkable in its ordinariness, or so Julia thought as she trudged out of St. Vincent Memorial Hospital. Her 12-hour shift in the emergency room had stretched her to her limits, her body aching from the relentless pace. The evening had been chaos. 3 trauma cases had flooded the ER after a catastrophic pileup on the state highway. The screech of ambulance sirens, the frantic calls for blood transfusions, and the desperate race to save lives still echoed in her mind. 2 patients had been airlifted to a trauma center, their conditions too critical for the hospital's resources. The third, a young man with a shattered leg and a fading pulse, had coded twice. Julia had stayed late, guiding a nervous new nurse through the delicate process of stabilizing him, her hands steady even as her heart pounded with the weight of responsibility. Then came the paperwork, an hour of scribbling notes and filling out charts under the harsh fluorescent lights. By the time she clocked out, the hospital corridors were hushed, the usual bustle replaced by an eerie quiet. The lights dimmed to a soft glow that felt almost ghostly. Julia tied her dark hair into a messy ponytail, her fingers trembling slightly from exhaustion, and slipped on her faded denim jacket over her teal scrubs. Her shoulders, sore from hours of lifting and maneuvering patience, protested as she slung her worn canvas bag across it. Stepping into the cool night air, she inhaled deeply, the faint scent of rain lingering. The parking lot glistened under a fresh drizzle, the tall lampposts casting halos of light that shimmered on the wet asphalt. Her car, a battered Honda she'd driven since her nursing school days, sat at the far end of the lot, its chipped paint and dented fender a testament to years of loyal service. She was halfway there, her hand digging through her bag for her keys, when a sound stopped her cold, a sickening, wet thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. She froze, her heart lurching as her eyes darted toward the noise. Near the entrance to the parking garage, a man in a tattered military jacket lay crumpled on the asphalt, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. Blood bloomed through his shirt, a dark, spreading stain that glistened under the lamplight. Julia's training kicked in before her mind could fully process the scene. Internal bleeding, severe, likely catastrophic. Her pulse quickened, not with fear but with the clarity that came in moments of crisis. She scanned the lot, expecting to see others rushing to help, but the world seemed to move in slow motion. A young couple nearby glanced at the man, their faces flickering with unease, then turned and hurried away, their footsteps fading into the night. Another bystander, a middle-aged man in a business suit, pulled out his phone, not to call for help, but to record, his face lit by the screen's cold glow as he captured the stranger's struggle. The man on the ground was fighting to stay conscious, his breath shallow and ragged. He didn't cry out, didn't beg for help, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the lot with a hyper-awareness that sent a chill through Julia. She followed his gaze and saw it, a black SUV with tinted windows and no plates, slicing through the parking lot at a speed that screamed intent. It wasn't parking, it wasn't slowing, it was hunting. Her instincts roared, a primal warning that urged her to run, to dive behind the row of hospital carts and watch from safety. She could have sprinted to her car, locked the doors, and driven away, her heart pounding but her body unharmed. But something deeper stirred within her, something forged in those quiet evenings with her father, in his words about showing up when it counted. It was more than training, more than courage. It was the unshakable sense that this moment was hers to meet. "Call 911, she shouted over her shoulder, her voice cutting through the stillness as she broke into a run, not away, but toward the man. Her sneakers slammed against the pavement, the sound echoing in the nearly empty lot. Her bag slid off her shoulder, thumping to the ground, but she didn't stop. The man was trying to push himself up, his arms trembling, his face contorted with pain and determination. Blood pooled beneath him, stark against the wet asphalt. Julia reached him just as the SUV screeched to a halt about 20 feet away, its tires skidding with a sharp squeal. The driver's window rolled down, and in the dim light she saw the glint of a gun. A muzzle flash erupted, bright and blinding, like a camera snapping in the dark. The crack of the first shot shattered the night. Julia didn't think. She acted. She threw herself forward, wrapping her arms around the man's shoulders, trying to shield his battered body with her own. Her only thought was to protect him, to buy him seconds, to give him a chance. Then came the pain, a searing fire that tore through her left shoulder, spinning her sideways as if she'd been struck by a sledgehammer. Her legs buckled, and she hit the ground hard, the impact jarring her bones. Her head smacked the pavement, stars bursting behind her eyes as the world tilted and blurred. The pain was overwhelming, a white-hot agony that radiated from her shoulder. But even as she lay there, gasping, her mind clung to one thought. She had shown up. Just as her father had said, she had shown up when it mattered most. The world around Julia shrank into a disorienting swirl of indistinct shapes and muted sounds, her senses overwhelmed by the searing agony that tore through her body. Pain pulsed in waves, blurring the edges of her vision into soft, glowing halos, while voices around her faded into a distant hum, as if she were submerged underwater. Yet, even as her body screamed and her mind teetered on the brink of collapse, one image burned vividly in her consciousness. His eyes. Those piercing, steady eyes of the stranger she had risked everything to save. They weren't frantic or wild with fear, as she might have expected. Instead, they held a quiet, almost incredulous intensity, as though he couldn't fathom why she, a complete stranger, had hurled herself into the path of danger for him. His gaze seemed to ask not just why, but how anyone could summon such reckless courage. In that fleeting moment, their eyes locked, and Julia felt an unspoken connection, a shared weight of survival that tethered her to him even as her strength ebbed. The roar of the SUV's engine shattered the fragile stillness, its tires shrieking against the wet asphalt as it sped off into the night. The vehicle vanished around a corner, swallowed by the darkness before anyone could react, leaving behind an eerie silence that pressed heavily against Julia's fading awareness. She lay sprawled on the cold, rain-slicked pavement, her blood pooling beneath her, mingling with the strangers. Each breath was a labored gasp, her chest heaving as shock set in, numbing her limbs and clouding her thoughts. The world seemed to tilt, darkness creeping in from the corners of her vision like ink spreading across paper. She fought to stay conscious, to cling to the moment, desperate to know if her sacrifice had meant something. Her lips moved, trembling, and a faint, raspy question slipped out, barely audible even to herself. "You safe?" She hadn't meant to ask it, hadn't even realized the words had formed until they hung in the air, fragile and unanswered. Then, like a curtain falling, the world dissolved, and she slipped into oblivion. When Julia first stirred, it was to a sensation of dull, oppressive weight deep in her shoulder, as if someone had pressed a heavy stone against her flesh and left it there. The pain was no longer sharp, but a constant, throbbing presence that seemed to anchor her to the present. Her nostrils flared at the sharp, sterile tang of antiseptic, a scent that prickled her senses and tugged her back to awareness. A faint, rhythmic beeping filled the air, accompanied by the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead, their mechanical drone both comforting and alien. Her eyelids fluttered, struggling against the heaviness that weighed them down, and when they finally parted, she was met with the soft, unfocused blur of a white hospital ceiling. For a moment, her mind was a blank canvas, disoriented and adrift, unable to piece together where she was or why she was there. Then, like a dam breaking, the memories flooded back, the slick pavement beneath her feet, the silhouette of a man collapsing under the weight of his own wounds, the blinding glare of headlights, and the deafening crack of a gunshot that had torn through the night and through her. A nurse in crisp blue scrubs materialized at her bedside, her face kind but professional, her voice steady as she spoke. "Julia, you're in the ICU. You were shot, but you're stable now. You're going to be okay." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling through Julia's foggy mind. She blinked slowly, her thoughts sluggish as she tried to process the nurse's words. "Shot?" she murmured, her voice hoarse and unfamiliar. Then, with a sudden surge of clarity, she asked, "What about the man? The one I was with?" Her heart quickened, a flicker of hope mingling with dread as she waited for an answer. The nurse hesitated, her eyes flickering to the chart in her hands before meeting Julia's gaze again. "You were the only one brought in that night," she said carefully. No other victim was found at the scene. The words hit Julia like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. "That's not possible," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of confusion and defiance. "He was right there, I saw him. I was trying to protect him." Her mind raced, replaying the moment she had thrown herself over the stranger, shielding his body with her own as the gunfire erupted. She could still feel the weight of him beneath her, the warmth of his blood seeping through her clothes, the faint shudder of his breath against her cheek. How could he have vanished? The nurse offered a gentle, sympathetic smile but said nothing more, leaving Julia alone with her spiraling thoughts. Later that day, Dr. Levinson, her supervising physician, entered the room, his face a mask of professional calm that did little to ease the knot of unease in Julia's chest. He was a man she respected, whose steady demeanor had guided her through countless shifts in the ER, but now his unreadable expression felt like a barrier between them. "Julia," he began, his voice measured, "the bullet passed clean through your shoulder. You lost a significant amount of blood, but it miraculously missed all major arteries. You're incredibly lucky to be here." Julia winced as she shifted slightly, the movement sending a fresh wave of pain radiating through her arm. "Lucky," she echoed, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. Her mind wasn't on her own survival. It was on the stranger. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice firmer now. "The man in the parking lot, the one I saved." Dr. Levinson's gaze flickered, a subtle shift that betrayed his discomfort. "Julia," he said, choosing his words with care, "the hospital security team reviewed the footage from the parking lot. No one else was reported injured. No ambulance picked up another person that night. The police believe it was an attempted mugging, and you were likely the target." His words landed like a punch, each one chipping away at the fragile certainty she clung to. "No," she said, her voice rising with a stubborn edge. "That's wrong. I saw him. He was bleeding out. He was wearing a trench coat, like something military. I wrapped myself around him to protect him." Her hands clenched the hospital bed sheets, her knuckles whitening as she fought the urge to shout, to make him believe her. Dr. Levinson nodded, his expression softened with pity, but he didn't argue. "You've been through a lot," he said gently. "Rest is what you need right now. Let's not let this overwhelm you." Rest was impossible. The words "you were the only one" echoed in her mind like a relentless drumbeat, each repetition stoking the fire of doubt and determination that burned within her. She couldn't shake the memory of the stranger's eyes, the way they had seemed to hers with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. She hadn't imagined him. She couldn't. Throughout the next day, a steady stream of visitors filtered through her room, their presence both a distraction and a source of frustration. Her colleagues from the ICU brought flowers, their vibrant petals a stark contrast to the sterile hospital room, along with cards filled with well-meaning platitudes and awkward attempts at humor. But their words, meant to comfort, only deepened her sense of being misunderstood. Danny, a fellow ICU nurse with a tendency to gossip, leaned in close and whispered, "I heard it was a gang thing, Julia. You're lucky you didn't get killed." Nick, the trauma nurse who had worked alongside her for years, was more direct, his bluntness cutting deeper than she expected. "Some people are saying the guy you tried to save was a dealer, Julia. A lowlife. You really took a bullet for someone like that?" Julia turned her face to the window, her jaw tight as she stared out at the gray cityscape beyond the glass. Their words stung more than the wound in her shoulder, not because she believed them, but because they missed the point entirely. She hadn't stopped to ask who the stranger was or what he deserved. She had seen a man bleeding, alone, and in that moment, her instincts had taken over. It was what her father had taught her, his voice steady and resolute in her memory. You don't ask if they deserve help. You ask if they need it. That principle had guided her life, shaped her career, and driven her to act without hesitation in the parking lot. To her, it didn't matter if the man was a saint or a sinner. He had needed her, and she had answered that call. That night, long after the hospital had settled into its quiet rhythm and visiting hours had ended, Julia noticed something peculiar on her bedside table. A plain white envelope rested there, its presence unassuming yet oddly conspicuous, as though it had appeared by magic. No one had mentioned it, and she was certain it hadn't been there earlier in the day. Her name was written on the front in precise, flowing handwriting, but there was no other marking, no indication of who had left it. Her heart quickened as she reached for it, her fingers trembling slightly as she tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing a brief note in the same sharp, meticulous script. "No one can know who I am, but I know who you are. You didn't just save me, you saved more than one life. What you did in that parking lot ensured a mission could continue, one that will protect countless others. I owe you everything. LT4. Julia read the note 5 times, each word searing itself into her memory as her mind raced to make sense of it. LT4. What did it mean? A code? A name? The mention of a mission sent a chill through her, conjuring images of covert operations and hidden truths. The stranger hadn't been a dealer or a random victim. He was someone with purpose, someone whose survival mattered beyond that fleeting moment in the parking lot. The weight of his words settled over her, mingling with a quiet pride that warmed her chest. She hadn't just acted on instinct. She had made a difference, one that rippled far beyond what she could see. Yet the mystery of his identity gnawed at her, a puzzle she couldn't solve from the confines of her hospital bed. For now, though, the note was enough, a quiet affirmation that her sacrifice had mattered and that her story, the real story, was only just beginning. Julia Benton lay in her hospital bed, the sterile scent of antiseptic mingling with the faint ache in her shoulder, a constant reminder of the chaos that had landed her here. The letter she'd found earlier that day sat heavy in her mind, its words looping through her thoughts like a song she couldn't shake. It wasn't some cruel prank, as she'd first hoped. The signatures scrawled at the bottom, the cryptic mention of a mission, the way it referenced others who'd been involved. It was too precise, too deliberate. Her heart thudded unevenly as she recalled the man she'd saved, his military-issued jacket faded but sturdy, its olive drab fabric etched into her memory. She could still see the way he'd waved off the onlookers, his movements frantic yet purposeful. At the time, she'd thought he was in shock, pushing people away out of confusion. Now she realized it wasn't that at all. His eyes had carried a weight, a silent plea to keep others at a distance, not for his own sake, but for theirs. He'd been protecting them. Over the next 24 hours, as Julia's senses sharpened, her nurse's instincts kicking into overdrive, she noticed things she might have overlooked before. 2 men loitered in the hallway outside her room, their maintenance uniforms crisp but oddly unconvincing. They never touched a mop, never carried a toolbox, never even pretended to clean. Their postures were rigid, shoulders squared, chins tilted just so, military, through and through. She watched them through the sliver of her open door, her pulse quickening as she noted their silent vigilance. They didn't chat with the nurses or banter with the janitorial staff, their presence an anomaly in the bustling rhythm of St. Vincent's Hospital. When Julia asked a passing nurse about the extra maintenance workers, the response was curt, just extra security. The words hung in the air, vague and unsatisfying, stoking the unease that had begun to coil in her chest. That night, as she reached for her water glass, her fingers brushed something cold and metallic on the bedside table. Her breath caught. It was a coin, old and worn, its surface etched with the unmistakable eagle, globe, and anchor of the Marine Corps. This wasn't some cheap trinket you'd find in a gift shop. Its weight felt earned, its edges smoothed by time and touch, a tangible piece of someone's story. Julia's mind raced. She hadn't just saved a random bystander that night. She'd thrown herself in front of someone significant, someone who was a target, and now someone, somewhere, didn't want her to know why. The realization settled over her like a cold fog, sharpening her awareness of every sound, every shadow in the dimly lit room. By the next morning, Julia wasn't just healing from her injuries. She was watching, her eyes scanning for the smallest inconsistencies, her mind cataloging every detail of her surroundings. Something was wrong. The two men in the hallway didn't leave, didn't rotate out like normal staff. They stood like sentinels, their movements minimal, their gazes never straying far from her door. Their precision unnerved her. The way they held themselves, too straight, too disciplined for maintenance workers. When she tried to catch one of their eyes, hoping for some flicker of acknowledgement, he turned away sharply, as if her gaze was a violation of some unspoken rule. Julia's stomach twisted. She wasn't paranoid. She'd worked in trauma wards long enough to recognize patterns. She'd seen plainclothes officers guarding VIP patients before. Their presence subtle but unmistakable. This was different. No one had briefed her. No one had explained why she felt like a specimen under a microscope. The weight of their silent observation pressed against her, making her skin prickle with unease. Then there was the woman. She appeared mid-morning, gliding into Julia's room with an air of quiet efficiency. Her pale blue scrubs were standard, her tray of bandages unremarkable, but something about her felt off. Julia's heart gave a small lurch. She'd been at St. Vincent's for 3 years, long enough to know nearly every nurse on the floor. This woman was a stranger. She moved with a precision that bordered on mechanical, changing Julia's dressing with firm, practiced hands. Her touch wasn't unkind, but it lacked the warmth Julia had come to expect from her colleagues. As the woman turned to leave, she leaned in close, too close, her breath brushing Julia's ear. "He's alive," she whispered, her voice low and deliberate, "and he's grateful." Before Julia could process the words, the woman was gone, slipping out of the room like a shadow. Julia's fingers fumbled for the call button, her heart hammering as she demanded to know who the nurse was. The response from the desk was flat, almost rehearsed. No nurse by that name was on the roster today. The words echoed in her mind, hollow and unsettling. That night, sleep eluded her. Julia lay awake, her eyes fixed on the coin glinting faintly under the dim hospital lights. She picked it up, its weight grounding her racing thoughts. The Marine Corps emblem stared back at her, weathered but proud, and along the edge, a series of letters and numbers. 4th Recon, MRF. She had no military background, but her father's stories of his service had left an impression. A challenge coin wasn't just a token. It was a symbol of trust, of brotherhood forged in the crucible of sacrifice. It was given in moments of deep significance, often in the field, a quiet acknowledgement of shared struggle. Why had it been left for her? Her mind drifted back to the man she'd saved, his face vivid in her memory. His expression hadn't been one of fear or confusion, as she'd first assumed. It was recognition, not of her, but of the gravity of her actions, of the risks she'd taken without hesitation. Her shoulder throbbed as she sat up, the pain a dull reminder of that night. The pieces were starting to fit together, though the picture they formed was murky and unsettling. The SUV with no plates, the eerie silence that followed the chaos, the absence of any public report, no media coverage, no police interviews. It was as if the entire incident had been erased, swept away by an unseen hand. Julia's breath hitched as the truth settled over her. The man she'd shielded wasn't just wounded. He was critical, tied to something bigger. A mission, a secret someone was desperate to keep buried. And now she was caught in the middle, her act of bravery pulling her into a world she didn't understand. She clutched the coin tighter, its edges pressing into her palm, and resolved to keep watching, to keep noticing. Whatever this was, she wasn't invisible anymore. At 2 in the morning, Julia Benton stood at the threshold of her hospital room, her bare feet cold against the sterile linoleum. Sleep had eluded her, her mind a restless tangle of questions and unease. The thin hospital gown clung to her skin, amplifying the chill that wasn't just from the air-conditioned room, but from something deeper, something gnawing at her instincts. She cracked the door open, just enough to peer into the dimly lit corridor. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting long shadows that stretched like specters across the walls. Down the hall, one of the men she had assumed was part of the maintenance crew stood with his back to her, his broad shoulders hunched slightly as he spoke into a shoulder mic. His voice was low, deliberate, each word clipped with precision. Target remained stable. No unusual movement. Surveillance continuing through morning. Target. The word hit Julia like a slap. Not patient, not nurse. Target. Her breath caught in her throat and she eased the door shut, her movements slow and careful, as if the slightest sound might betray her. Her heart pounded, a frantic rhythm that echoed in her ears. She pressed her back against the closed door, her hands trembling as she tried to make sense of what she'd overheard. She wasn't just under protection, as the hospital staff had assured her of. She was under watch, but why? Her mind raced back to the letter that had been slipped under her door 2 days ago, its cryptic message scrawled in precise handwriting. Your actions saved more than one life. The words had puzzled her then, but now they felt like a warning, heavy with implications she couldn't yet grasp. Had she stumbled into something bigger than herself? Had she unknowingly disrupted a covert operation? Something classified and dangerous? Whatever it was, someone was making sure she stayed silent, but safe for now. She crossed the room to her bedside table, her steps unsteady, and picked up the Marine Challenge coin that had appeared mysteriously beside her bed the day after the incident. Its weight was solid in her palm, the embossed eagle and anchor gleaming faintly in the moonlight filtering through the window. Whatever had happened in that parking lot wasn't over. Deep down, Julia felt a chilling certainty. This wasn't just about the man she'd saved. It was about what he was carrying and why someone had wanted him dead. The hours dragged on, each one heavier than the last, until the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the room in hues of amber and crimson. A knock on the door startled her from her thoughts. It wasn't hurried or hesitant, but firm, deliberate, carrying an authority that made her stomach twist. Julia sat up in her hospital bed, smoothing the thin blanket over her legs, expecting another nurse with a tray of lukewarm food, or perhaps the administrator with discharge papers. Instead, the door swung open and a tall man stepped inside, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. He wore a Marine Corps dress uniform, the navy blue fabric crisp and immaculate, adorned with a cascade of ribbons that spoke of a lifetime of service. His posture was rigid, as unyielding as a steel beam, and his steel-gray eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as though he could see every thought swirling in her mind. He removed his white cap with a practiced motion, tucking it under his arm, and offered a small, respectful nod. "Miss Benton," he said, his voice deep and steady, carrying the weight of command. "May I sit?" Julia nodded, her throat tight, her pulse quickening with a mix of curiosity and dread. She watched as he lowered himself into the visitor's chair beside her bed, his movements careful, almost gentle, as if he were mindful of the fragility of the moment. He set his cap on his lap, his fingers resting lightly on its edge, and for a brief moment, she glimpsed a flicker of something in his eyes. Gratitude, perhaps, or respect. "My name is Colonel Thomas Granger, United States Marine Corps, retired," he began, his tone calm but laced with purpose. "I'm not here in any official capacity. In fact, nothing I'm about to tell you will ever appear in any record, but you deserve to know the truth." Julia didn't speak. She couldn't. Her hands gripped the edge of the blanket, her knuckles whitening as she waited, her mind teetering on the edge of revelation. The colonel glanced toward the hallway, his sharp eyes scanning for any sign of eavesdroppers, then leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "The man you saved in that parking lot was Commander Ethan Rohr. one of our most elite special operations officers. He was returning from an international mission when he was ambushed. The SUV that opened fire on him wasn't some random act of violence. It was a calculated assassination attempt. The word assassination sent a jolt through Julia's body, her breath hitching as the weight of it settled over her. She blinked, her mind flashing back to that chaotic night, the screech of tires, the crack of gunfire, the man collapsing in a pool of blood under the sodium glow of a street lamp. She'd thought he was just a stranger, a victim of senseless violence. "Assassination?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Granger nodded, his expression grim. Commander Rohr was carrying intelligence, not in a briefcase or on a device, but in his memory. He'd spent 8 days embedded with foreign assets, gathering critical information on multiple planned attacks. That intel was time-sensitive, irreplaceable. If it had been lost, lives, hundreds, maybe thousands, would have been at stake. Julia's head spun, the room tilting as she tried to process the enormity of what he was saying. She'd acted on instinct that night, dragging the wounded man behind a car, pressing her hands against his bleeding wounds until help arrived. She hadn't known who he was or what he carried. To her, he'd been a man fighting for his life, nothing more. He refused extraction by helicopter, Granger continued, his voice steady but tinged with admiration. He didn't want to draw attention to his team or compromise the mission. Instead, he insisted on walking out alone, blending into civilian infrastructure to minimize the risk. But someone betrayed him. They leaked his route, knew exactly where he'd be. The colonel's jaw tightened, a flash of anger breaking through his composed facade. "And you, Miss Benton, were in the wrong place at the right time." Julia's lips parted, her voice trembling. I was just there," she said, her words fragile, as if they might shatter under the weight of the truth. "No," Granger said firmly, his eyes locking onto hers with unwavering conviction. "You weren't just there. You acted. You made a choice when most people would have frozen or run. You saved a man who carried the weight of countless lives in his mind." He reached into the inner pocket of his uniform, his movements deliberate, and pulled out a small object wrapped in a soft cloth. As he unfolded it, Julia's breath caught. It was the same Marine Challenge coin she'd found beside her bed, its surface etched with symbols of honor and sacrifice. But this time it wasn't alone. Nestled beside it was a small silver pin shaped like an eagle, its wings outstretched, gleaming in the fading light. In the quiet of her hospital room, Julia Benton's gaze fell on a small, dark pin resting on a folded cloth in Colonel Granger's outstretched hand. The pin was subtle, almost unassuming, but the emblem etched into it, the insignia of the 4th Reconnaissance Battalion, carried a weight that made her breath catch. Her fingers hovered over it, hesitant, as if touching it might confirm a reality she wasn't ready to face. "This," Granger said, his voice low and steady, "is Commander Rohr's personal coin. It's a rare honor, given only to those who've saved a Marine's life in the heat of combat. He wanted you to have it." Julia's heart stuttered. Her mind raced, replaying the chaos of that night, the gunfire, the screams, the instinct that had driven her to act without thinking. "Is he alive?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and dread. She barely knew Commander Rohr, yet the thought of his survival felt like a tether to her own sanity. Granger's eyes, usually sharp and unyielding, softened just enough to betray his respect. "He's recovering, quietly. Because of you, Julia. You held the line long enough for him to escape, long enough for the support to pull him out. Your actions didn't just save one man. They stopped 3 planned attacks on U.S. embassies within 72 hours. Intelligence confirms hundreds of lives were spared because of what you did." Julia's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. The enormity of it crashed over her like a wave, threatening to pull her under. She was nobody, a civilian, a paramedic who'd stumbled into a nightmare. "I'm no one," she murmured, her voice cracking. I did what I was trained to do. Help people. That's it." For the first time, a smile broke through the hard lines of Granger's face, softening the edges of his weathered features. It wasn't a wide grin, but it carried warmth, admiration, and something deeper. Recognition. "That's exactly why this matters," he said. You didn't act for glory or because someone ordered you to. You acted because it was right. That kind of instinct, that kind of heart, is rarer than you know, even among those who wear the uniform. He rose slowly from his chair, his movements deliberate, as if to underscore the gravity of the moment. He reached for the cloth, leaving the coin in her trembling hand, its cool metal pressed against her palm, grounding her in the surreal weight of his words. There'll be no medal pinned to your chest, no press conference to tell the world what you did. What happened that night stays classified. You understand that, don't you? Julia nodded, her throat tight. She didn't care about headlines or recognition. All she'd ever wanted was the truth, to know that her split-second decision had meant something. But Granger paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame, and turned back to her. His voice dropped, softer now, almost personal. Commander Rohr and his team wanted to thank you in their own way, quietly, personally. Tomorrow morning before you're discharged, there'll be a small ceremony. No cameras, no reporters, just Marines, in a moment we all believe you've earned. He held her gaze for a beat longer, his eyes searching hers as if to make sure she understood the depth of what he was saying. You changed the course of events that night, Julia. You didn't just save a man, you saved a mission. You saved lives, lives that won't forget you. With that, he settled his cap back on his head, offered her a salute, not the sharp, mechanical kind, but one slow and sincere, and stepped out of the room. Julia sat frozen, the coin heavy in her hand, its edges pressing into her skin. Silence enveloped her, but her mind was anything but quiet. Her father's voice echoed through the years, steady and unshakable. Right is still right, even if you're the only one doing it. She'd always carried those words close, but now they felt carved into her soul. That night, she hadn't just been in the right place at the right time. She'd been the right person, the one who'd chosen to act when everything screamed to run. Sleep eluded her that night. Her thoughts churned, replaying Granger's words. The weight of the coin, the surreal truth that her actions had rippled far beyond what she could have imagined. By the time soft sunlight spilled through the hospital window the next morning, Julia was already awake, sitting on the edge of her bed. Her arm, still cradled in a sling, ached with a dull, persistent throb. But the pain felt distant, overshadowed by the nervous anticipation coiling in her chest. A small ceremony, just Marines, in a moment you deserve. The words looped in her mind, both comforting and overwhelming. She dressed with care, choosing a crisp, button-down shirt and dark jeans. It wasn't much, but it felt like armor against the vulnerability of the moment. Standing in front of the small mirror, she smoothed her hair and studied her reflection. The woman staring back looked tired, her eyes shadowed with the weight of the past week. But there was something else there too, a quiet strength she hadn't noticed before. Dr. Levinson came by to check her vitals, his usual brisk efficiency replaced by a gentleness that caught her off guard. "Before you go," he said, his voice soft, "there are some people in the lobby who'd like to see you." Julia nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her throat felt tight, her heart a drumbeat in her chest. The walk down the hospital corridor stretched endlessly before her. Each step echoed in the quiet hall, her sneakers soft against the polished floor. Her shoulder ached with every movement, but it was nothing compared to the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Anticipation, disbelief, and a profound sense of something she couldn't quite name. As the elevator door slid open into the main lobby, she froze. There, at the center of the room, stood 12 Marines in flawless formation, their dress blues immaculate under the fluorescent lights. Their boots gleamed like mirrors, their posture rigid yet radiating pride. Their eyes were fixed ahead, not cold or distant, but filled with a quiet reverence that made Julia's breath catch. Behind them, a small crowd had gathered along the edges of the lobby. Patients in wheelchairs, nurses pausing mid-step, even a few hospital leaning against the walls, watching in hushed awe. The space, normally alive with the casual hum of hospital life, held a sacred stillness, as if everyone sensed the weight of this moment. Julia's heart pounded so fiercely she thought it might break free. She stepped forward, her legs unsteady but resolute, drawn to the Marines by the formation that stood as a silent tribute to her courage. She wasn't sure what to expect, But as she approached, one of the Marines, a tall, broad-shouldered, stepped man, stepped forward. His face was weathered, but his eyes held a warmth that eased the knot in her chest. "Mr. Benton, he said, his voice carrying across the room. "We're here to honor you." The words landed like a spark, igniting something deep within her. She wanted to protest, to say she didn't deserve this, but the sincerity in the faces of the Marines before her silenced those doubts. They weren't here because of protocol or obligation. They were here because they believed in what she'd done, because one of their own was alive. And because of her, so many others were too. The ceremony unfolded with a simplicity that made it all the more powerful. The Marine officer recounted the events of that night, not in detail, for much remained classified, but enough to paint a picture of her bravery. He spoke of a woman who'd acted without hesitation, who'd risked everything to save Commander Rohr, whose survival had thwarted a chain of attacks that could have claimed countless lives. Each word built on the weight of the moment, and Julia felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense of being seen. When the officer presented her with a folded flag, a gesture of gratitude from the team, she accepted it with trembling hands. The Marines snapped to attention, their salutes crisp and unwavering. The crowd around them clapped, their applause a soft, respectful acknowledgement of a woman who'd never sought it. Julia stood there, clutching the flag, the coin still in her pocket, and felt her father's words resonate once more. Right is right. Only as the formation dissolved, a few Marines approached her, their voices low and earnest, offering personal thanks. One, a young man with a scar above his brow, gripped her hand tightly. "Commander Rohr wanted to be here," he said. "He's alive because of you. We all know what you did." Julia could only nod, her voice lost in the tide of emotions. When it was over, she returned to her room briefly, the flag and coin now resting on the bedside table. The hospital felt different now, less like a cage, more like a space where she'd been reborn. As she packed her things, she realized she wasn't just leaving a hospital behind. She was stepping into a life forever changed, carrying the weight of lives saved, of a mission preserved, and the quiet, unshakable truth that she'd been the right person when it mattered most. The hospital corridor, usually a blur of hurried footsteps and urgent voices, had fallen into a profound stillness, as if the building itself held its breath. Commander Ethan Rohr stood at the head of his unit, his bandaged right arm a silent testament to the trials he'd endured. Despite the pain that lingered in his body, his stance was unyielding, shoulders squared, his presence commanding respect without a single word. His dark eyes locked onto Nurse Julia Benton the moment she stepped into view, her scrubs slightly wrinkled from a long shift, her face etched with the quiet exhaustion of someone who gave more than they had. There was no smile on Ethan's face, not in the conventional sense, but his expression carried a depth that spoke louder than any grin could. It was a mixture of honor, gratitude, and a solemn recognition of something sacred, something that transcended the chaos of the world they both inhabited. Inside, Ethan wrestled with the weight of what he was about to do. He'd faced gunfire, ambushes, and the relentless uncertainty of war, but this moment felt different. It was personal, raw, and humbling. He was about to honor a woman who had no idea of the ripple effect her actions had caused, and the responsibility of conveying that truth made his chest tighten. Julia, unaware of the ceremony awaiting her, felt her heart skip as she saw the formation of Marines before her. Her mind raced, searching for context, her palms growing clammy as she sensed the gravity of the moment. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. Her life was spent tending to others, fading into the background of their recoveries. But now, under the steady gaze of Commander Rohr, she felt exposed, vulnerable, yet oddly anchored by the sincerity in his eyes. "Nurse Julia Benton," Ethan began, his voice steady but laced with a warmth that carried across the room. He paused, letting her name settle, as if to ensure she understood the weight it now held. "4 nights ago, you made a choice that changed the trajectory of countless lives. Lives of people you'll never know, in places you'll never see. You faced danger head-on without a second thought. You saw a stranger, wounded and alone, and treated him as if he were your own family. You didn't know my name. You didn't know the stakes of the mission I carried. But you acted without hesitation because that's who you are at your core. The words hit Julia like a tidal wave, crashing over her with a force she wasn't prepared for. Her throat tightened, a lump forming as she fought to keep her composure. She remembered that night vividly. The dimly lit parking lot, the chill in the air, the figure slumped against the car, blood staining his clothes. Fear had gripped her, but something deeper, something instinctive, had pushed her forward. Now, hearing Ethan's words, she felt the enormity of that moment in a way she hadn't allowed herself to process before. Inside, she was a storm of emotions: pride, disbelief, and a quiet ache for the simplicity of her life before that night. Ethan nodded to his men, and in perfect unison, the 12 Marines snapped to attention, their boots striking the tiled floor with a sharp, resonant click that echoed like a heartbeat. Their hands rose in a synchronized salute, each movement precise, deliberate, a tribute carved in motion. The sound reverberated through Julia's chest, and she felt her knees weaken under the intensity of it all. This was no ordinary gesture. It was a moment that no photograph could capture, no award could replicate. It was pure, unfiltered respect, and it overwhelmed her. Ethan stepped closer, his boots soft against the floor now, holding a folded American flag in his hands. His voice lowered, but its strength remained. "This flag," he said, "flew over our base in Syria during the mission you helped protect. It's seen places most Americans will never know, endured dangers most will never face. It came home because of what you did that night." He extended the flag toward her, and Julia reached out, her hands trembling as she accepted it. The fabric was heavier than she expected, not just in weight but in meaning. She clutched it to her chest, her fingers brushing the stars and stripes, her heart pounding with a mix of awe and responsibility. Then Ethan reached into his pocket, producing something smaller, a challenge coin, its surface glinting under the hospital lights. Julia's breath caught. She recognized it immediately. Days ago, she'd found an identical coin on her bedside table, a mysterious token that had left her puzzled and unsettled. Now, seeing it in Ethan's hand, given so solemnly, she understood its significance. "Only one of these is issued to a Marine," Ethan said quietly, his voice almost a whisper now, "meant for her alone. But this one belongs to you, not for bravery in battle, but for the bravery and compassion you showed when it mattered most." Tears welled in Julia's eyes, blurring her vision as she took the coin, its cool metal grounding her in the moment. She tried to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just did what anyone would do," she managed, her words quivering with sincerity. Inside, she meant it. She'd never seen herself as extraordinary. She was just a nurse, overworked, underpaid, navigating the grind of hospital life. But Ethan's faint smile told her he saw something else. "That's exactly why you're a hero," he said, his voice soft but resolute. He stepped back, and as he did, the Marines lowered their salute in unison, the motion as crisp as it had begun. A gentle applause started, tentative at first, then swelling into a wave that filled the corridor. Nurses clapped, their faces beaming with pride for one of their own. Patients, some leaning on crutches or IV poles, joined in, their eyes bright with admiration. Even the hospital security guards, usually stoic, wiped tears from their cheeks, nodding in silent respect. Julia stood in the center of it all, the flag in one hand, the coin in the other, frozen in a profound mix of awe and humility. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, clear as if he were standing beside her. "Right is still right, even if you are the only one doing it." For years, those words had been her compass, guiding her through moments of disquiet. But now they took on a new resonance. For the first time since that night in the parking lot, Julia allowed herself to believe something extraordinary had happened. She hadn't just saved a man, she'd done the right thing, and it had rippled far beyond her imagination, touching lives she'd never trace. What makes a hero? Is it the uniform, pressed and adorned with medals? The title earned through years of sacrifice? Or is it the quiet decision made in the fleeting space between instinct and fear? The moment no one witnesses, when a person chooses to act, not because they're obligated to, but because it's right. Julia Benton never saw herself as a hero. She wasn't trained to storm battlefields or navigate war zones. She carried no weapon, wore no rank on her shoulders. She was a nurse, a weary, dedicated nurse who'd walked into a parking lot at the wrong time, or perhaps the exact right time. That night had changed more than one life. It had reminded her and those around her of a truth that often slips away in a world of snap judgments and fleeting attention. Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's silent, unnoticed, woven into the fabric of a single, ordinary choice. Julia's actions hadn't made the news, but they'd rewritten a story far greater, greater, one of compassion, resolve, and the enduring power of doing what's right. In the fading light of a chilly evening, Julia Benton trudged through a dimly lit parking lot, her shoulder aching under the weight of a heavy tote bag. The pain was a dull, familiar throb, a reminder of long hours spent hunched over her desk at the community center where she worked. Her mind was already drifting toward home, her small apartment, a warm cup of tea, maybe a few pages of the novel she'd been savoring. But then she saw him, a man crumpled on the cold asphalt, blood pooling beneath him, his shallow breaths barely audible over the distant hum of traffic. Her heart lurched, a jolt of fear and urgency snapping her out of her exhaustion. This wasn't just a fleeting moment of discomfort. This was a call to action, one she couldn't ignore. Julia's decision to act wasn't born in that instant. It was the culmination of a lifetime of quiet fortitude, shaped by a childhood in rural Arkansas where resilience was as much a part of the landscape as the rolling hills and whispering pine trees. Her father, a Gulf War veteran with a gruff exterior and a heart full of unspoken lessons, had instilled in her a simple truth. Doing what's right doesn't need a spotlight or a crowd cheering you on. He'd taught her to stand firm, to face hardship with a steady gaze, whether it was fixing a broken fence in a storm or listening to a neighbor's troubles without judgment. That strength, honed through years of small, unseen battles, surged within her now. She didn't pause to weigh the risks or question the man's worthiness. She saw a human in pain, and her feet moved before her mind could catch up. Dropping her bag, Julia ran toward the stranger, her sore shoulder protesting with every step. Her pulse raced, not just from the sprint, but from the weight of the moment. What if she was too late? What if the violence that had left him bleeding wasn't over? Yet fear was no match for the fierce compassion that drove her forward. Buffoniard. Kneeling beside him, she pressed her scarf against his wound, her hands trembling but steady enough to apply pressure. Her voice, soft but firm, reassured him as she called for help, her words a lifeline in the chaos. The parking lot, usually just a stretch of cracked pavement, transformed into something sacred. A battlefield where kindness clashed with cruelty, where empathy stood taller than any weapon. Julia didn't know his name, his story, or whether he was a saint or a sinner. It didn't matter. He was a person, and in that moment that was enough. What made Julia's act extraordinary wasn't just the courage it took to run toward danger. It was the way it reflected something universal, something quietly heroic that pulses through countless lives across the country. Think of the nurse who lingers after her shift, holding the hand of a patient who has no one else, her own exhaustion pushed aside by the warmth of connection. Picture the teacher who notices a student's worn-out shoes and quietly slips money for lunch into their backpack, knowing hunger can't wait for bureaucracy. Imagine the stranger who pulls over on a rain-slicked highway to help push a stalled car, their clothes soaked but their heart full. Or the veteran who spends weekends at a shelter, serving meals with a smile that hides his own struggles. These are the everyday warriors, the ones who don't make headlines, but whose small, selfless acts stitch together the fabric of a community. Julia's story, monumental in its own right, holds up a mirror to these quiet heroes. It asks us to look at ourselves, to wonder what we do in a moment that demands courage. Would you stop for the stranger in need, even if it meant risking your own safety? Would you step into the fray, shielding someone from harm, knowing no one might ever know your name? Julia's choice wasn't about glory. It was about showing up, about refusing to turn away when the world asked her to act. And maybe that's the truest kind of bravery, not the kind that charges into battle with a sword, but the kind that chooses to care when it's easier to keep walking. A week later, Julia sat on the creaking porch swing at her father's house in Arkansas, the familiar scent of pine filling the air. The sling on her arm was a constant reminder of the night that had changed her, though the pain in her shoulder had dulled to a quiet ache. She wasn't the same woman who'd left this porch months ago. There was a new weight to her presence, not pride exactly, but a deep, unshakable conviction. Inside the house, a small wooden box sat on the mantel, crafted by her father's calloused hands. It held a folded flag and a challenge coin, tokens of gratitude for what she'd done. Beside them were old family photos, faded but cherished, and a rusted set of dog tags from her father's days in the Gulf War. They were relics of service, of moments when ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things. Her father hadn't said much when she'd arrived home. He'd simply handed her a steaming mug of coffee, draped a worn blanket over her shoulders, and sat beside her on the swing. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding of two people who knew the cost of doing right. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice rough but warm. "I always knew you'd do something this being that mattered," he said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Julia didn't reply. She didn't need to. The world would keep turning, oblivious to what she'd done in that hospital parking lot. Her name wouldn't grace the front page, and the people who passed through that lobby would never know the violence she'd helped stop. But that was never why she acted. Sometimes being a hero isn't about rewriting the world's story. It's about standing firm in a single, fleeting moment, choosing to see someone's pain and refusing to look away. Julia's courage was a spark, a reminder that we all carry the potential for greatness within us. It's in the choice to stop, to help, to care, whether it's shielding a stranger from harm or offering a kind word when it's needed most. Her story invites us to reflect on our own moments of quiet bravery, those times when we've stood up for someone, helped a stranger, or spoken out when silence felt safer. Those moments, however small, are part of something larger, a tapestry of compassion that binds us together. So what's your story? Have you ever acted on instinct to help someone in need? Share it, because those stories remind us of who we can be at our best. And if Julia's courage moves you, let it inspire you to act, to care, to be the right person at the right time.